he has a covenant with Abraham. He creates life early on, and he destroys almost all of it on purpose with a flood because he regrets something. He regrets the evil in man's heart. He regrets violence. And so with a great act of drowning, he drowns the world. Love, maybe, but not sentimental love. Put aside, if you will, the idea of an afterlife after physical death, which we almost automatically associate with some religions today. As this story is told, I don't think there's any idea of an afterlife. Dead is dead. Abel is not somewhere enjoying his reward for being innocent and good. He's dead. His blood is crying out from the ground. Chapter 1 reaches back to that divine presence before the universe was made, and it's a part of the Bible that everybody has heard of. From then on, the emphasis is very much on human beings, overwhelmingly on man rather than God. In a way, that's the last time we're going to see God by himself doing something. You might say, in fact, that the story of the Bible is the unfolding of human nature and its dealing with God. Elie Wiesel says everything human is in the Bible. I think he's very close to right. The Bible is about human beings, the human heart. It's about God as a participant, not as a kind of disinterested observer, but as a participant in history. The amazing Hebrew idea is, one of them is that God plays a role in history. And history is an ongoing, unfolding process, not a cycle, as the Mesopotamian city people would believe. History is not a cycle like the cycle of a year. History is an ongoing, changing, unpredictable, unfolding process, and God plays a part in it. This being of goodness and love, this being who says light is good, plays a part in it. He creates human beings free, and he doesn't change the conditions. He doesn't make them unfree. Instead, he reacts to what they do. Man and woman disobey. God punishes them terribly, expels them from the garden. Innocence is ended. There is no way back. He puts a guardian at the entrance to the garden. We're not going back there. There's no way back to innocence. Any more than as a person grows up from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, there's any way back to that childhood innocence. God is still there after the punishment, still dealing with mankind. What does he want? Well, remember Gilgamesh sneering at Ishtar. What can I possibly give you, he says to her. The implied answer, of course, is you can give me your body. You can give me your seed. And I may turn you into a frog or a bird with a broken wing. I don't know. But your city will be prosperous, and things will be fertile, and things will go well. God wants something else for mankind, not a sexual embrace, right? He wants obedience. He apparently wants something he sometimes calls righteousness, although it's not clear always what that is. He wants attention, not as a gift so much, but as a response to his command, as part of a covenant or part of a bargain. Sometimes it may even seem God doesn't know what he wants. He might be learning, but it always seems to go back to the idea that the original thing he created was good, and that the being of things in some way is inseparable from goodness, however black and dark and violent and incomplete they are. So God will never do magic in the sense of repealing the laws of things. It was finished on the sixth day. He's not going to create another kind of species. He made this species free. So he sees the first murder. He doesn't bring Abel back to life. He reacts to Cain. He sees that mankind is by nature violent. He reacts to it. He sees the first cities. He reacts to them. Eventually, after expelling man from the Garden of Eden, go, you must leave. Eventually, after trying again with the flood and saving one man and his family from the flood, God seems to decide on a different approach. Here's where the covenant, the contract, the bargain with a single individual. Something along the lines of what he previously did with Noah, but different. And that's where the history of the Jews, the history of the Hebrews begins. Chapters 1 through 11 in the Bible, we're not dealing with Jews, we're dealing with mankind. In chapter 12, the book becomes the history of a particular nation. Because God promises a particular individual, whose name is Abram, that he will be the father of a great nation. The promise is not, I will make you happy and make everything smooth for you and dry your tears and listen to your problems and make sure that things go well for you. That's not the promise at all. It's a promise very much in terms of creation. He thinks what Abraham would most want is huge offspring, just the way God created a huge, multifarious universe. And it turns out apparently to be true. Abraham accepts the bargain. From that point on, Genesis is the story of a particular people, and it turns out to be the peoples who are writing the whole thing. They have a covenant with the divine being. They are different from the other peoples, even as this being is different from the other so-called gods, and he has singled them out. And now they are telling the story of this. They begin in chapter 12 to talk about themselves, and the story goes something like this. Scott, if we could have the map now, too. Just drop the screen and let's take a quick look at the area here. This people begins, they say, as a nomadic people. They come originally from ancient Mesopotamia, from Ur of the Chaldees, as Professor Reynolds said. Let's see if we can get the map up there. Can we get, yeah. Is it well focused? Everybody see this? Yeah, just give me a yes or no. Yes. No. Okay, would you focus it, please, Scott? There's Uruk. Beautiful. Oh, much better. Much better. There's Uruk, which we know something about. There is Ur, where Abraham's family first comes from. Sometime around 1800, these dates are on your sheet there, the period when Professor Reynolds says the cities were in some kind of trouble, the rise of kings, the rise of warfare, the rise of problems with food. These people leave behind the great cities here, and they move up to Haran, which is somewhere up in this area. It's not on the map, but it's in that area there. Following the Euphrates River, move up to Haran, as the story says. Some stay there, but originally they were already on their way, they said, from here down to here. You don't cross here because this is all sheer desert. So Abraham's father, Terah, is on his way from Ur to Haran. He stops there. The family stays there, even though he originally meant to go to Canaan. But Abram is his name at that time, comes down here into the land of Canaan, which is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Chapter 12 begins with that story about the great ancestor Abraham, who left Haran, went down into Canaan. Why did Abraham leave? He took all his extended family with him. He left because God said, go, in a kind of more gentle and interesting replay of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. God says, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. This is Genesis chapter 12. And this sets up the great pattern which runs through the history of these people. They are people who hear the divine command and go. The first command is leave. Leave everything you know. Notice how that narrows in. Leave your country, leave your kindred, leave your father's house, and go. I'm going to show you something. Abraham obeys. He comes on down into Canaan, and this seems historically right. The Hebrew peoples are historically, as far as we can tell, a wandering Semitic people who are thought of as coming down from the north into Canaan. There are already people in Canaan at the time when Abram first gets there. And yet this is the land that God says he will give him. How is that to be? It belongs to someone else. Apparently it won't be given right away. And the stories tell about how Abraham and his son Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob, wander in Canaan with occasional visits back to Haran. When it's time to choose a wife for Isaac, he doesn't get to choose his own wife. A servant is sent back to Haran because we want to marry within our kindred, not with the Canaanite peoples that we are among. When it's time for Jacob to find a wife and also run for his life from his brother, he heads back to the family connections in Haran, and finds his 2 wives there. The chapters of Genesis are very much about the wanderings of these people in that land of Canaan, up and down it, into places that will later be recognizable to the Hebrews when they settle there. Abram goes all the way down into Egypt, goes into that dark land of Egypt, which will play a big part in their destiny. The rest of them don't get that far, but they wander within that area. Eventually, the 12 sons of Jacob go down to Egypt and become their offspring, their descendants, who multiply enormously, become 12 tribes, and these 12 tribes are enslaved by the Egyptians. Generation after generation grows up with some memory of the great patriarchs, perhaps, but basically we know we are slaves to the Egyptian people. So this people goes through a whole multi-hundred-year history of slavery, at the same time becoming stronger, more and more numerous as a people. And so the story says that around 1300 BC there was a great exodus. Somehow an amazing leader named Moses, a fantastic person, was able to confront the Pharaoh and was able to release these people from slavery and bondage, which not all of them wanted because Egypt was a very good place to be. Lead them wandering in the Sinai desert, out of Egypt, and back up into the Promised Land. Moses doesn't make it, but the rest of the people do. The land that was originally promised to Abraham. When they get back, of course, there are people there. There are cities there. And so their settling in the Promised Land is a settlement of conquest. It's a settlement of war. It's a settlement of destruction of cities. And eventually the 12 tribes parcel out the land in Canaan and declare it theirs. This is the story from the rise of Moses is told in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Joshua tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the settlement in Canaan. While the people are in the desert, they're given a whole set of laws and regulations that binds them together as a people and orients them towards what is good. We're going to be not reading those books of the Bible. We are going to be reading 1 and 2 Samuel, which tell about another astounding series of events. Settled in this area, under constant military threat from the people that were originally there, these people who began as nomads, who went through a period of slavery, decide they want to be a city people with kings. Give us a king. And 1 and 2 Samuel tell the story of how they become, finally, a city people and the first of the 2 greatest of their kings, Saul and David. Good. I think we can have the lights and remove the map. So where does Genesis fit? Well, as I said, Genesis tells about the patriarchs, tells about the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather of these 12 tribes, the distant ancestors of the people who are writing down this history. So always picture when you're reading Genesis, the people looking far, far back at who are our ancestors, where do we come from, who are we, what can we hope for, where are we directed? Because these people have a sense that they are directed somewhere. Not simply back to the stationary city, but that they're going somewhere. Why do we have a right to this land of Canaan? So Genesis contains also stories about the other peoples in Canaan. Who are those people around us? Who are those desert people to the south? Who are raiders, and yet very like us? Well, they're the Ishmaelites. They're descended from Ishmael, who was the son of our ancestor Abraham, but whose mother is not Sarah. She's an Egyptian, apparently a maid or slave woman. Her name is Hagar. So the Ishmaelites are our half-brothers. But if you look at the story, our ancestors treated their ancestors very badly. God took pity on the mother and son. And indeed the son's name, Ishmael, means God has heard. They are rivals. They are half-brothers and close to us. They know about God. And they are opposed to us. This ancestor story gives us a feeling of why. So we don't feel at all towards them as we do towards those disgusting people that we hate, the people to the east, the Ammonites, the Moabites. They are descended from Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, so they are related to us too, but they came about when the daughters of Lot got him drunk and slept with him. They are the product of an incestuous union, and they are bad people indeed, the Ammonites and Moabites. That's where they came from. In general, the pattern is we are like the younger brother, the one you wouldn't expect to succeed, The second one, the less likely one. We are Jacob. We're the struggling, tricky one. We're not the great hunter Esau, who is the father of the Edomites. We are Isaac, the one who went a terrible experience with his father. Bound on the altar, his father has the knife ready. He realizes his father is willing to sacrifice him to some being called God. We are Isaac, we are not Ishmael, the mighty hunter and raider who is Isaac's half-brother. Ancestor stories are a big part of the book of Genesis. And looking at how very aware and intelligent people talk about themselves is indeed of interest, but not by any means the main thing that makes the book of Genesis one of the greatest books in the world. Another answer to the question of who are we is we are not a people of cities. We left behind the great cities. In fact, humankind is essentially a gardening being. We began in a garden. The first city in the world, if you read closely, notice was built by Cain. The first city came from the first murderer. He built it for his son. So there is bloodshed and strife at the origin of cities. Cain was a farmer. Remember Professor Runnels explaining how cities depended on large agricultural projects. Abel, the good brother whom he killed, was like us. He was a nomad. He was a shepherd. Nevertheless, Genesis says, it is the descendants of Cain, the first killer and the first builder of cities, who invent music. It's the descendants of Cain who invent metalworking. In other words, who invent art, who invent technology. And they also invent even more intense forms of murder and vengeance. Presumably they're on their way to inventing warfare. Cities are treated in the story of the Tower of Babel. You see those ziggurats, those imitation mountains that Professor Runnels talked about. They are interpreted by the Hebrew people as towers. The word Babylon means gate of God, but the Bible takes it to mean Babel, confusion. Babylon, Babylon. And those great towers are taken, those ziggurats are taken as trying to reach up to the heavens and challenge God. And the walls of the cities are taken as something solid enough never to be scattered. And guess what? God destroys the towers, shatters the languages, shatters the walls, and scatters the people. You can't do what Gilgamesh hoped for at the end of Gilgamesh and have a solid city whose walls you can admire and boast about. In the book of Genesis, you are going to hear from divine power not in cities, not in those temples at the heart of the cities. You're going to hear outside, under the stars. Come outside, Abraham, and count the stars. Have you ever seen what stars look like? I'm sure you have. In dry air, in desert air. Unbelievable. You just fall up into the billions and billions of stars. And they seem to go, you get the sense of depth that you don't get when you see them in the city, how they go on deeper and deeper endlessly. Look at the stars, Abraham. That's going to be your descendants. God is outside in the Bible. How about you're sitting under the oak trees? Abraham is sitting under the terebinths at Mamre. And in the shimmering heat of the desert, three figures are coming towards him. And being a hospitable nomad, he waits on them, and they're God, walking through the shimmering heat out of the atmosphere up to his tent. So Genesis is a book of origins and patterns and promises. If you want just a quick, I think, summary of what this book is about, origins, patterns, promises. What are some of the patterns? Let's look at it. We've already indicated some. How about the fact that humankind, in this way of dealing with things, starts with the first marriage? There is no marriage ceremony, but clearly Adam and Eve are husband and wife. So the human story starts with a domestic scene, man and woman dwelling together. The original pattern says, more important than conquest, more important than knowledge, more important than cities, first and foremost, this is the pattern of patterns, this is the origin of origins. From that comes companionship, from that comes mutual help, from that comes God's great command, increase and multiply, from that comes the raising of children. And the Bible continues to be very concerned with marriages, family things, children. Never sentimental about this. It sees families as they are, and perhaps worse than they always have to be. Quarrelsome, jealous, hiding their purposes, taking advantage of each other, threatening each other, rivalries between brothers, tensions between parents. But it all traces back, says Genesis. The origin is in this first dwelling together of man and woman. This is the original pattern. Something science may change in our time. perhaps increase and multiply, won't be dependent on this dwelling together of man and woman. It will be cloning the next generation. Well, how about the pattern that includes, she gave some to her husband and he ate. She gave some of the forbidden fruit to her husband and he ate. The Bible's version of the story of Shamhat and Enkidu, the story of how woman brings man from innocence into civilization, and that's both good and bad. In Gilgamesh, Shamhat seduces Enkidu. There's a 7-day mating. In the Bible, much less glamorous, but perhaps more profound. She gave something to her husband, and he ate. Dinner time, Adam. Here's the fruit. And the man does what his wife tells him. Amazing scene in one line. And yet you can start to think, how did it happen? You have to imagine it. Did he eat that fruit knowing what it was because he knew he couldn't live without her? Does he do it out of supreme pity for her, sacrificing himself? Does he do it because husbands do what their wives say? Does she have to nag him? Eat it, eat it. Did he do it out of despair? If this is what life is, then I'm going to eat this too? Did he share her spirit of daring for a moment? Did he not want her to be a step ahead of him? And he did it to keep up. No, the woman shouldn't be a step ahead. I'm going to eat this too. How did she present it? Did she say it was a good thing to do? Did she breeze in all brisk and hip? Guess what I found out about today? This is where it's at. This is where things are going. Did she already know it was bad when she gave it to him? Did she know it but not admit it to herself? Deep down she knew it was bad, but she was still pretending it was good. Was she ambitious? Get off your lazy butt, Mr. Gardener. It's time to move on. You know that stuff the serpent told you and all that stuff you told me about don't touch the tree? It's not true. We can become like God. Let's get going. Was it like that? Is it because Eve realizes that she can't bear the loneliness of being the one who is eating this? And Adam, looking at her, says, maybe I could bear it, but I see that she can't bear it. And therefore, I will join her. Well, the Bible insists that if you are going to read it at all, you're going to have to ask questions like this. How is it between men and women? You have to start understanding how is it between men and women to understand that line. She gave some to her husband, and he ate. Sets another pattern for the rest of Genesis. Abraham's wife tells him something, and he doesn't, even if it might be wrong, even if it might be harmful. Sarah hears God making a big promise to Abraham, and she laughs. She doesn't believe that stuff. Rebecca is a woman of real courage. She's the one who steps out. She's the one who leaves her family for an unknown marriage. She later deceives her husband Isaac, again with food. Again, it's food coming to the man. She finds a way of getting around his plans and seeing to it that the son that she favors, and she knows probably is really the more intelligent and better of the two, is going to be the one that gets the blessing. Love of Rachel leads Jacob to do incredible things, to work for, 14 years. The minute he sees Rachel, all of a sudden this surge of strength goes through him, and he lifts the rock off the well that they usually have to wait for 5 or 6 guys to lift off. So this pattern between the woman and the man plays itself out through Genesis and plays itself out through the rest of history. Of course, there is the pattern of rebellion or transgression. From this time on, man is the one who is going to rebel, who's going to cross the line, who's going to do the forbidden thing. There is the pattern of God dealing with man. Now, what is that pattern? It's easy enough to say that it's God testing man, sometimes atrociously. Abraham is certainly tested. I think if you read that story with your imagination, with your heart, you see that Abraham is testing God too. There's a terrible mutual struggle and test going on between the two of them. But more directly, we see Abraham test God when God's on his way to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham goes along with him, which is a polite thing to do, but then he starts talking. You know, while we're on the way, I hear you're a just God. When you get to Sodom and Gomorrah, if there's 50 good people there, are you really going to destroy it? Oh no, if there's 50 there, I guess. Well, how about if there's 40? How about if there's 30? I'm just a man talking to God. But if there's 20 good people, then what kind of universe is it? Does God destroy a city with 20 good people and 2,000 bad ones or not? All right, 20, I won't do it. Why does Abraham stop at 10? It's an interesting question, but he does. But even more directly, it's not just God testing man. If you think about Jacob, Jacob completely turns the tables. God tests Abraham, Jacob tests God. God says to Abraham, do what I tell you, I will be your God. Jacob wakes up from a dream and says to God, do what I tell you, and maybe you can be my God. Make me prosperous, don't let me get killed, get me back home safely after I become prosperous, and maybe you can be my God. This is your test, God, says Jacob. This is part of the greater pattern of what happens to a great religious idea or any great thing. We see this through the lives of the three patriarchs. Abraham, not everything about him is admirable by a long shot, but he is obviously a great man who understands the promise and deals directly with God. Isaac has had a terrible experience in his childhood. Basically, he repeats the things his father did. He does fewer of them, but he digs the same wells, he wanders to the same places, he has the same experience with his wife, treating her as a sister. Doesn't seem that interested in the promise, but he does want to pass it on. He seems mainly more interested in food and some kind of safety and security and some kind of comfort. And the third son, Jacob, doesn't seem to even know what the promise is. He just knows he wants it. Looks like something good. There's a good chance to trick my brother. I'm going to take it. It's only later in life that maybe he begins to understand it. A short, profound history of what happens to any institution, any great idea, any religious impulse in the three stages of it. Lots of other patterns in Genesis that help us read human life. I haven't mentioned the greatest pattern because I think it's the hardest one to talk about, but the gradual discovery of the meaning of human life. Not in any way prettified or disguised, seen in all of its savagery, all of its obtuseness, all of its blindness, all of its selfishness, all of its crime, all of its terror. It even says, very hard-mindedly, some of the advances come through crime. Some of the advances come through evil. No one, as I said before, has a more open-eyed take on what human beings really are than the Bible. They see it all, they talk about it all. But the great thing is, in the Bible, man is in an open-ended history where he makes and discovers his own meaning, somewhat in the way God makes the universe out of language. So whereas at the end Gilgamesh can only return to the city walls, can only return to that temple, which, as Professor Runnels noted, don't last, but to Gilgamesh they seem eternal, the Bible sees man not as going back, but on an ever-evolving journey. And God seems to change in reaction to that journey. He seems part of the journey. Gilgamesh discovers, as the story somewhat sarcastically says, a secret of the gods. And the secret seems to be the gods don't really care about or understand human beings. We live in a universe of huge forces, quite unpredictable, not human. The best thing we can do is return to the human order, the walled city, and hope that that will protect us and immortalize us to the extent that we can be, and that's where we can be human. It's not what the Bible says. The Bible says the essential spirit of the universe is creative. It's not in any one place. There is an ongoing meaning to life. Despite the evil, it has something to do with that moment when God saw the light was good. It has something to do with the struggle between good and evil. Human beings are mostly bad, but they somehow are seeking the good. History is mostly made by crime and violence and struggle and our desire to be in control, our desires to be the divine ones. And yet, from time to time, in some way, some greater power than us responds to that, and something new comes. Things do indeed always change. The final yardstick of change, even though it sometimes doesn't seem that way, is goodness or righteousness. That's the final thing the world is to be measured by. Going right back to that first chapter of Genesis. So you get a lot of human evil, but the pattern of patterns seems to be that again and again the voice is heard, the dream comes, and it's the conflict between good and evil. And this conflict is in human beings. It's in the human heart. Thank you very much.